Welcome to the RCAP USA Roundup, a podcast where we have real conversations affecting both cattle producers and beef consumers. We're your hosts, Jaden Moreland and
Karina Jones.
With that, let's get to today's episode. With the future of the American cattle industry hanging in the balance and the loss of over 500,000 cattle producers since 1980, it's clear something has to change. What can we do to help bring back profitability and the beauty of the American cattle industry? How can we learn from the downfalls of the hog and chicken industries? We sat down to talk current legislation, competition, vertical integration, and a changing cattle industry with generational Iowa cattle feeder and RCAP USA Vice President Eric Nelson. Let's start with just give us a quick introduction and tell us about yourself, your family, your operation.
Well, I'm a fourth generation farmer and cattle producer here in Northwest Iowa, along with my wife, Carol. And Carol and I have been married for 33 years in June. 5 kids, 2 of them that are partners in the farm and cattle operation, and 2 grandsons and 2 granddaughters. And our second son is an agronomist, and our youngest son is a diesel mechanic, and then our daughter is a sophomore at Iowa State University. So that's our family, and it is a family operation. We've got a couple part-time individuals that will help us as needed, but virtually all of the labor ends up coming from our family. And so we've all got skin in the game. My wife is a Nebraska native, so I'm married to a Husker, and so we joke a lot about our mixed marriage of an Iowa Stater married to a Husker, and so now my oldest son is married to a young lady from Nebraska, and my second son is married to a young lady that was born in Nebraska, and so but we're only 20 miles away, and so we are in an interesting location here. 20 miles from Nebraska, 20 miles from South Dakota, and only about 70 miles from Minnesota. And so we get news from all of those states. And of course, I'm biased. I've lived here my whole life, and of course, Western Iowa is where most of the livestock in the state, particularly cattle and hogs and sheep, reside. There's livestock scattered around the rest of the state, and some of the big poultry operations and swine finishing units are not only located here, but throughout the state. But just to the north of us, about 35 miles, is Sioux County, Iowa, which has the most cattle, hogs, and sheep. And I forget what the ranking is on poultry, but so livestock is big here in Western Iowa, and that's why I love it here.
So can you tell us more about what y'all do on your operation?
This time of year in April, we're getting field equipment ready. We raise corn and soybeans primarily. We raise some hay. We have a commercial seed business, so I'm in the process of delivering corn and soybean seed to customers every day, working around the weather, and we're calving. We have a cow herd kind of in the middle of calving season right now, and so far that's going well, as it should when it's really dry. We're not fighting any mud this spring anyway. And so then on top of the cow operation, then we have 2 feedlots that we grow and finish cattle in, although their capacity is down this year versus what it's been in the past. But we started out primarily as a cattle feeding family. When I was young, we never had cows. We actually had sows, and we raised hogs and fed cattle, but we never had cows. That was added to our family about 30 years ago that we got into the cow calf side of the business. And that's it's led me into a lot of different things that I take it for granted what we do, raising cattle and feeding them out, but there aren't very many of us left. We're kind of an endangered species. So kind of what's going on this time of year, April and May are probably the most time critical months of the year. Planting season is kind of always that way. And right now we're just waiting for it to warm up and praying for rain every day.
Yes, as I think most everyone in the country is, it seems like. So you've been involved with RCAP for a while now. It's been almost since the beginning, correct?
Yeah, I've been a member for 20 years this year. And I can still remember the first RCAF meeting that I went to. A neighbor, one of my best friends, who used to rodeo all around the country, and he's has a seed stock operation, cattle seed stock operation, and had several rancher friends out in Montana. And he invited me to go to a meeting, and I was actually working at that time back in 2002. I was still working full time in the seed business, was a sales manager, but we had cattle already then. And he invited me to that meeting that night, and everything really clicked in what I saw, and I've been a member ever since.
Awesome. So as you kind of talked about, y'all are a family operation. Y'all are a generational operation. So can you tell us more about your history in the cattle feeding business?
As all farm kids end up doing, you help out and do what you can, depending on your age. But already by the age of 10, I was, feeding cattle on my own and filling in when my dad and my brothers weren't around. And then, we kind of were growing our cattle feeding business while I was a kid, and then, into the 1980s. And then the 1980s were very tumultuous. There was a dairy buyout program in 1986 where the government paid dairies to liquidate their cows, and there was a huge oversupply of market cattle at that time. But it actually opened an opportunity for me. And on the backside of the dairy buyout is when I started to feed cattle, and then, like so many in this part of the world, a lot of folks end up seeking some off-farm employment. And my grandfather had been in the seed business since the middle 1960s, and he and I were very close. And so I've worked in the seed business since then, but was worked full time in the seed business for about 15 years, and actually left that employment about the time that I went to my first RCAF meeting. And since then, it's allowed me to be involved and pushing forward on these issues to ensure that future generations have a spot.
Being a multi-generational independent cattle feeder, you have had to have witnessed some changes in the cattle feeding business through the decades. Talk to us about what those changes have been and how this packing industry has guided those changes.
Yeah, probably the first memory that I have of that, I was pretty young, and a buyer for one of the packing companies, his name's Frank Gilbert. Right? He's getting up in years now. I still see him every once in a while, but he would show up on a Monday morning to actively try to buy slaughter cattle on a Monday morning. And already by 2010, that started to really go away, and the buying would happen just one day a week, generally late in the week, often mid-afternoon on Friday, or later, even in about a 20-minute time frame. And so that's kind of the bookends of what I've seen, going from Monday morning active buying and maybe having 10 different packer buyers stop by. A good friend of mine, Colonel John Phillips, I can still hear him on the radio saying, "Mom, get the kids out of the driveway. The packers are, there's a lot of traffic." And now, suffice to say, there isn't much traffic anymore.
Leads me to another question. How long has it been since you have had multiple bids for your fat cattle in 1 week? 2 bids in 1 week?
Well, no, we've continued to keep 2 bids or 3, but there's generally only one that's a steadfast bid. There will be a couple of the bids will generally be below what's even reasonable. And so there'll be maybe $2 less than the other bid. And so there generally only ends up being one choice, and the other 1 or 2 bids that are generally there. Not always. There were times, through COVID, where there maybe was only one, when things got backed up so bad. But most of the time, there still ends up being a couple, but they're not what I would call really active bids in the true sense.
So we see some media, some social media influencers say, why don't you guys just demand more for your cattle? Why don't you just hold out? What is the climate of those conversations when you actually have a packer that is bidding? What is the climate? I mean, do you have that power to say, I want more, and actually know that you will get it?
That all sounds really easy, but a good friend of mine had this happen. I'll just use this as an example. of how hard it is to carry that out. 2 weeks ago, a good friend of mine sold around 2,800 head of slaughter cattle that week. And there was really only one packer that was active that had, again, that top bid that I'm talking about versus the other packers that were bidding back a ways. And that packer was really adamant that they had supplies, that they were almost 3 weeks out before they were going to need those cattle. And that's always what's in the back of every feeder's mind is how long is it going to take for those cattle to be called for? Because if they're really done, if they're really at 12 o'clock, you don't really want to feed them for another month. They need to go to town. And that was really, I've been looking back at COVID. That was the real horrible part about the COVID market, is when I ended up feeding cattle, yearling cattle that were already 1,500 pounds, and I had to feed them another 90 days before we could get them slaughtered. And the financial ramifications there are terrible. So anyway, back to my friend who sold those 2,800 head at kind of just steady money, because a lot of indicators were that the packers had some inventory bought, and that was on a Thursday. The next morning he got a call from that Packers scheduler, and they ended up, all those cattle had been slaughtered by Monday night, the following Monday. So those cattle were all delivered and slaughtered within 4 days. And there's just, you do the best you can. And this guy sells a lot of cattle in a year's time. So he is not a neophyte at all, right? He has a lot of contacts, and, he had cattle that needed to be sold, and if you get cattle that are really ready, and that's probably the other big change versus the old days, is there was a time back 25 years ago that if you really thought that the market was going to break and go down, you could try to get bids for cattle that were really under ready, and they would bid. They maybe would bid less, but they would still bid and buy, and you could make a choice to make an early exit to kind of try to play the market a little bit. And now you absolutely don't have that wherewithal, because they generally don't want the cattle until they're at 1 o'clock. They would be willing to take them a little over fat. The percent primes go up, the amount of trim goes up, but the white fat, the good white trim off of young beef ends up being blended with imported older cow meat that comes in just the lean. The imported cow meat doesn't come in. Nobody wants to buy hamburger that has red flesh speckled with yellow fat. They expect white fat. I still believe that we're feeding cattle to a very extended end date to provide some extra fat for the blending business. But that's kind of got off on a tangent there.
So I remember a conversation that you and I had last fall about, you and your son's decision to kind of change the complexion of your feedlot capacity. And go back to that decision that you guys made last fall to not load up on feeder calves.
Yeah, and it actually all started at the Superior Corn Belt Classic sale, kind of the first big video platform of the summer, and it was actually hosted right here in Sioux City. And so we went to the hotel, and had a bunch of friends there, and we were watching cattle sell ones that we'd fed before, and I was sitting at a table of non-buyers. They were all friends, and we were working our calculators, and we were from $10 to $20 a hundred away from being able to buy those cattle to where they made any sense at all. And that was back when corn maybe was being priced at $5 a bushel, and I just sold some corn here this morning for $7.70 a bushel. And so we had to really, think long and hard. And it's really difficult, especially when we have some family relationships in the cattle business that go back 50 years. And we've had to leave some of those cattle behind, and they're tremendous cattle, but you have to be able to see that you have a chance. And little did I know when we did make the decision to pull back, that some primarily red Angus cattle that we had fed into the fall that we were going to have so much trouble getting those cattle marketed. And back in the day when the hog industry was being integrated, the big driver was the crutch was genetics, that the consumer has demanded a better pig. And it's, the folks at Nyman Ranch would say that we maybe didn't develop a better pig because they've created a whole side market for heirloom hogs that basically the same hogs we were raising prior to 2000. But in around the year 2000 is when the hog feeding industry demanded that the people that were going to be players had to raise a certain kind of pig. And so here we are 22 years down the road, and last fall had some high quality red Angus cattle that just were unsaleable for 6 weeks. And finally, when the packer finally came forward with a bid, it was on the grid. And of course, the quality grade was outstanding, but the yield grade was terrible. They were mainly 4s and 5s because they had been fed 6 weeks too long. And that's as close, I think, as that we dare get, because again, they're mandating what genetics we're going to be able to raise. And that's just way too reminiscent for me of how 95% of the hog producers were forced to the sidelines. And then in the hog business, they had to build a certain kind of building to house the new leaner hogs that wouldn't survive in a cold climate. And within a couple of years, it was over, and the swine industry was integrated. And the first real losses were the seed stock producers were gone just immediately, because once somebody else starts making your genetics decisions for your herd, all of the independent seed stock producers are no longer needed.
Staying on that topic of, vertical integration, and, you kind of giving a recap of what you saw in the 80s and 90s and what funneled the hog industry. I mean, not funneled, it railroaded that industry right for vertical integration. What do you say to those people that say, this cattle industry, it's too big to be vertically integrated?
I think that there were a number of folks, and maybe even me included along the way, that were hopeful that, and I know I had a good friend that rest his soul that fed a lot of cattle not too far from here. He always said that, it was our saving grace is that they can't push a bunch of cows into a confinement and breed them and have them have a calf, and which is what, in the hog industry, it was for a long time anyway, it looked like that was all easy peasy. But now you have environmental groups that are pushing back and don't want all of these hogs as crowded as they are. And so that debate is still going on, kind of see where that's going to go. But I had thought for, probably by 2010, fully realized that the choke point would ultimately end up being market access. And that's really what it's gotten down to, is market access. Just like this last fall, when we were trying to sell those red colored cattle, we really, we didn't have access to the market. Same way during COVID, we didn't have access to markets, and we watched cattle that were AMA cattle that were going right by the U.S. highway that we live on every day, while we went nearly 3 months without being able to move anything, and so and so all of that ends up being highly inefficient. But at the same time, the packing industry says that everything that they do is because of economics. Well, it's really because of the economics of their per share profit, is what I would say to that. So,
it becomes really real for me as a cow-calf producer to have this conversation with an independent cattle feeder who this year said, I can't come to the market, to the feeder calf market, and compete with these corporate feedlots. I'm out, and I think that we saw that in the barns, that there weren't as many buyers in the seats, and there's not going to be as many buyers probably this next year. What is your future in the cattle feeding business if there aren't some major reforms made to start protecting the independent cattle feeder?
So without meaningful change, we'll continue to focus on the cows that we have, and feeding those calves out. And we currently, this year we'll direct market the meat from about 20% of the calves that we raise. And unless there's meaningful change, we'll continue to work to try to expand that and market those animals directly to consumers as aggressively as we can. Otherwise, if we get change, and I've told this story before in front of the Senate Ag Committee. Why was it important for these changes that we've been fighting for? And I would say that because of the system on how we run our farm. It's sustainable. Everybody talks about sustainability. Our hopes are to raise enough cattle to eat the grain that we raise on the land base that we have, and use the manure that's generated to supply the factory of our grain production in kind of a closed loop system, and it works pretty well. And we don't have a lot of freight. And that's the one thing that's going to drastically change. All of these production systems that were developed the last 40 years, right now we haul a tremendous amount of feed all the way to the high plains, and then all the meat has to be, trucked all over the country. Same way with, the state of Iowa produces almost, the majority of the country's eggs, and then everything has to be, trucked from here. And all of our production systems were all predicated on cheap fuel, and we no longer have that. That's for sure. And so I'm still hopeful. I'm still fighting every day, because we just want to go back to, why we built, the 2 feed yards we have. My folks retired in 1996, and there was a little nucleus on the one location, and we rebuilt that and started from scratch where we live. And it's rewarding. On our north feed yard, we've got initials in concrete, written by, etched in by my grandfather, by my dad, by myself, by my boys. And now we have some concrete that's been poured here with initials put in by a grandson, and none of that's taken lightly. And I know a lot of other producers around the country feel that same pressure, to try to not break the chain, and to try to keep things going. We operate in a barn at one of our feed yards that my grandpa and great grandpa built in 1930, completely from scratch. And there's not a time when I'm in it or near it that I don't think about all the fights that they had, the dry years, the war years, and I'd written that down too here, that I don't think that all of the folks in the armed services over the years that have given the ultimate sacrifice, I still don't believe that they did that in preparation to hand over our economy to just a couple corporations. I really don't think that that's what this country was destined for. I really don't. And so, we'll continue to fight.
Nobody is more aware of the menu of different legislative reforms being offered than you as an independent cattle feeder. You are the cattle feeder. We've got all kinds of media out there, all kinds of social media influencers talking about these legislative reforms, but they don't make their paycheck off of feeding cattle like you do. So you tell us which one of these options out there are the meaningful options that are on your radar that will help your next generation continue to feed cattle.
I wrote a few notes down because it is a jungle of all that's going on out there. But, the bottom line for me is that once competitive forces are allowed to be lost in a market, it's really difficult to get that genie back in the bottle and to restore competition. And that's why I just see a lot of flailing around right now in Washington, trying to, I think there's recognition that there's a problem, and although some people probably have no idea how big it is, but I think that there are attempts that are being made that are sure to fail. One of them are there's a big focus on new plants, that we've got to have new plants. Well, for several reasons, I have issues with that. So we have a highly profitable industry And the current players that are making the most money aren't the ones that want to build facilities, right? So that one's, my crap detector kind of goes off when you think about that. And new plants have been tried before in the past. And the one here in Iowa that was a great template, it was a cooperative venture. A bunch of cattlemen bought shares and slaughtered their own cattle. And one of the big players just hammered them when it came time to sell meat. And they didn't have enough money. It takes a lot of money to fight competitive forces when you're big enough that you have to try to steal some major grocery chain order business. And then it becomes a completely different deal. And so I see that being that attempt out there. The compromise bill, I think, is loved by the lobbyists. There's all kinds of angles for lobbyists to interject. And I think that ultimately it'll be its downfall, because it was written more for the lobbyists than for what it's really going to do for the industry. And again, when competitive forces are lost, it's going to take strong action. And there's very little that I see anywhere in that compromise bill, in either version of the compromise bill, that was going to be anywhere close to strong enough action. When the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico area is going to be allowed to cash negotiate at 10-11%, I mean, that's basically their sorts already. And then that's going to just lower the market in that area, because those are the cattle that the packers really don't want to own in the first place. So, and then on the labeling side, there's a whole bunch of attempts to address things on labeling, and it's still mandatory country of origin labeling that hits the nail on the head. And I want to go back a little bit to, on our initial push for that back in 05, 06, 07, and we got it passed, and it until it was taken away. Those years we had decent leverage. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. And that's when things really changed, was in about the time that Cool washed out, is when we really took a huge turn. And so the way I look at it, we've got to return the cash trade in all regions, and allowing certain regions, just because they have disproportionate lobbying power, to allow them to have a different minimum. It's not how we do business. It'd be the first time in the history of the country where we're going to regulate a sector of the economy just based on what region they're in. And I think that's just full of pitfalls. And ultimately, it's not going to get done what we need to get done, because it's the action of all the alternative marketing arrangements that have been done, the captive supplies that are gathered in the Southwest, is what ends up upsetting the equilibrium for everybody else. We're already, and I haven't looked, I should have looked at what we traded last week. The week before, it was in the 60s percent wise of cash negotiated trade in Iowa and southern Minnesota. And so we continue to not be the problem up here as far as percent cash trade. But when the prices end up being set in the South, and we end up kind of having to play by those same prices, and their quality on average is way lower than ours, the percent choice that gets slaughtered in the Southwest on a weekly basis is still way lower than here. And so for us, even to get the same prices as the South is really hurtful, because we end up paying more. A lot of the feeder cattle that are fed here are coming from your direction, Karina, or South Dakota, Montana, very high quality cattle. And we haven't for a number of years been able to recoup our investment in those better cattle, because the prices generally get set off of the captive supply country. And I get it. That is why the packing industry is lobbied heavily against making any changes there, because they kind of have it the way they want it. So back to the bills. 5014 is the bill that was, not made for lobbyists. It was pretty simple, 50% cash delivered within 14 days. Every plant that where the owner of the company had more than one plant, and it's pretty simple and can't be massaged by outside forces. Mandatory country of origin labeling, same way. It's pretty simple. I'm tired of the demagoguing done by the packing industry, telling about the huge costs of MCOOL. And the Homeland Security laws passed in the early part of the 2000s after 9/11 mandates lot tracing. And so all of the lot tracing of all the beef and cattle through the system already has to be done. And so this whole cost ruse is nothing but a ruse. And the two economists from the University of Tennessee put a paper together about 2 years ago that really pretty well stamped that. And so I'm waiting, though, as the battle for MCOOL continues to heat up. I'm guessing we'll hear about the plight of the packers and all the costs, and that's hogwash is what that is.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. The simplicity of MCOOL and 5014 are actually what the lobbyists are fighting, because it doesn't give them a paycheck throughout the years to be able to, as you said, massage those laws and continue to have them ebb and flow to meet who they work, to meet the standards of who they work for. So very well put.
But if I further could expand just a little bit on 5014, it's been our position at RCAF is that would still be a transitory program, because we're still going to have real levels of competition returned. And so there's kind of still a major project ahead. Even if we were to get 5014, there's going to have to be some permanent reforms that are made, as I see it, similar to what was done back 100 years ago, to really bring all of the major packers into a competitive situation. Because without that, any money that's going to be spent by good people trying to build a packing plant to be competitive, and there are a couple of them that are proposed right now for out in western Nebraska, and one here just straight south of me here in western Iowa, that unless something is done to deal with the raw market power that the big four have, it's going to be really, really, really tough sledding. And I'm not, I don't really like the idea of putting out big government grants to help those firms, because that's my money too. And we've got to get back to everybody realizing that that grant money that comes from the federal government is all a chunk of our tax money.
So recently, there was a kind of a flurry of activity with RCAF in Iowa, and you and Bill Bullard met with Iowa State students in a really big assembly. Talk about what happened at Iowa State.
Well, it's a fun set of circumstances. The head of the animal science teaching department at Iowa State, Dr. Brad Scar, was one of my judging coaches that I had a bunch of years ago when I was at Iowa State, and he's been there ever since. And now, pulls together all the teaching activity there. And I've been fortunate enough to lecture at in front of a sophomore level ANSI class, ANSI 226. Dr. Scar reached out to Bill and myself back in January, I believe, asking if Bill would come and lecture a couple of senior level ANSI classes, and Bill was gracious enough to come. And so we headed to Ames, and there are around 200 of these senior level ANSI students, and it was the class is basically a seminar class on industry happenings, really. And so there's nobody better really at the time than to have the RCAF CEO Bill Bullard and all of his years of experience. And we had a nice tour of the facilities there in the meat lab, and and there was staff also in attendance as well as the students. And it was just tremendous. And we had a lot of students that stuck around to ask questions after. There were a lot of questions that went on in front of the whole group toward the end of the presentation. And it was, it was a super opportunity. And, there's concern, I would say, I'll use the word concern on behalf of students, when they're 21 years old and thinking about their future, they're kind of shaking the tree, wondering, can I make this work? How can I make this work? And I know every lecture that I've made there, I always ask how many of the students, their goal in life is to be an owner of cattle, and it's almost universal, those kids in those classes. And so, they're wanting to learn and not always aware of the industry happenings politically. And so it was a tremendous outing. And I think it really shows that there are a lot of friends to RCAF throughout the industry. People are aware that there are changes happening in our industry, and there's an education level. There's a level of awareness that everybody needs to have, and we kind of battle that every day. There are folks that join an organization and assume that organization is looking out for their best interests, and because of that, there can be cattle producers that aren't keenly educated on a lot of these issues, and a lot of them are fairly detailed. And Bill has a great way of unraveling a lot of those complexities, and he really hit the nail on the head that night.
Well, I know that we've received a lot of great feedback from some of the student body that was in attendance for that presentation. And in fact, we hope to get one of those Iowa State students on a future podcast episode to talk about what they experienced listening to Bill. And as you said, their hopes, their dreams of wanting to come back into the industry, but really having to lean into what is the climate? I mean, can we make this work? So from Iowa State, the next night, you and Bill traveled south to Osceola, Iowa, and had a fantastic producer meeting with South Central Iowa producers. Talk to us about that meeting.
Yeah, we had a great talk. The next night, Bill and I traveled to Osceola to the Clark County Fairgrounds there, and a great individual that I just got to know probably 6 weeks ago. He actually called in and had a question at the RCAF office, David Savage, and he and some friends have kind of banded together cattle producers in about 3 counties, and they've worked up a list of potential solutions and things that need to be done to bolster profits. And they're really profit driven, and they're looking at when they get done selling their calves for most years out of the last 10, that there isn't enough money left at the end of the year, and many times not nearly enough. And so they're really working hard on that. And that was really the impetus for having the meeting, is they wanted to be educated on exactly what was going on the cutting edge politically. And then and they had shown up that night. There were a half dozen pickups and gooseneck stock trailers there with signage on them. And the next day they went to the federal building in Des Moines and met with representatives of Senator Grassley and Senator Ernst, and presented their list of asks and potential solutions to this issue. And a lot of them mirrored closely what RCAF is working for. And a number of the people in the room that night were RCAF members, and some folks that I hadn't seen for a long time. And so it was a great venue, kind of on the backside of COVID. A lot of people are just glad to see their friends and not, maybe not close neighbors, but in the cattle business, it's kind of the same way everywhere. Everybody kind of knows who the cattle producers are, even if it's several counties away. And it's just, they haven't had the chance to rub shoulders that way for a while. And so it was all tremendous. But of course, the frosting on top was Bill, again, given that tremendous, powerful presentation that he has, that really closes the loop on why we need to have restorative action on competition and why we've got to have mandatory country of origin labeling.
Okay, so as we wrap up, one question we always like to ask people on the podcast: what is your favorite cut of beef and how do you like it prepared?
Well, I'm going to give you a first and a close second, because if you'd asked me a year ago, it maybe would have been the other way. So it kind of just depends where I'm at. But the New York strip, prepared medium rare, of course, and then char crust is actually my favorite seasoning to put on a New York strip. And so you'd have if you Google char crust, you'll see what it is. And it's a proprietary blend of seasonings that the garlic peppercorn version is my favorite. So that's how I like a New York strip. A close second, though, would be a tenderloin or filet with garlic and pepper, and a lot of pepper. I can, either one is going to be pretty excellent, pretty awesome.
That sounds really good. I need to go eat lunch now. I'm hungry. Okay, any final thoughts before we jump off here?
Well, the only final thought that I would give is that I think that, I was, Bill and I were out in Washington, D.C. last week for a couple of days of meetings with a group that RCAF's been involved with for a number of years, working on trade issues in and out of agriculture. So some of it has to do with trade of manufactured goods, and then some of it with ag goods. And momentum is headed our direction. I guess that would be my message from after being out there at that meeting. We had 3 senators and I think 7 congressmen came and visited with us, and they all asked to come. There weren't any of those that were courted to come and speak to us. They wanted to. And so I think that there's some realization that we had outsourced a little bit too much of our economy. And I think that can be good for our agriculture and particularly for our cattle industry. Now, there will be folks that say that, oh yeah, but exports. And I think those will continue, because again, we have the premier beef product the world over, raised under the best of conditions. But we're hollowing out rural America by continuing to outsource a lot of our beef that we consume in this country, which is at 20% right now. And so, but I'm really encouraged. I think there's a movement afoot in this country to look within, and our agriculture is strong. And I think it's gonna lead the way for our country, kind of back out of kind of this malaise that we're in. And I'm really encouraged by what I saw out in Washington, D.C.
We are so thankful that you got to come and join us on here today, Eric, and we are so appreciative of you and your work on behalf of the American cattle industry. As Eric described, we have watched the downfalls of numerous facets of American agriculture because of integration, and the cattle industry is headed for the same path. We have to do something, or else the next generation is never going to get to experience the true beauty of being independent cattle producers. We have to band together and fight for our freedoms, our legacies, and the next generation. We at RCAF encourage you to be involved, make your voice heard in Washington, and educate yourself on the issues affecting your industry. Call your senators and encourage them to say no to compromising the American cattleman by regionalizing the cattle industry, handing over the cattle market to the USDA, and much more. Tell them to say no to the compromise bill, S4030. Instead, tell them to help create valuable competition in the cattle market by requiring packers to purchase 50% of their cattle on the cash market with the 5014 Cattle Market Protection Bill, S949. Tell them to help support reinstating mandatory country of origin labeling for beef with S2716 and HR 7291, the American Beef Labeling Act. Please reach out to us with any questions and follow along at RCAF USA on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the RCAF USA Roundup. To learn more about RCAF USA, visit our website, www.r-cafusa.com.